Gurney here. We have horsewhipped the phones into compliance with our wishes. They are playing ball with us now. John Berkman, the professor of moral theology at Regis College at the University of Toronto. Professor, thanks for being here. Sorry for the phone problems this morning, but we're glad we're able to connect.
No problem, Matt. Happy to be with you this morning.
This is really interesting stuff. We know, because the Supreme Court has said so, that Canada will have an assisted suicide law. We seem to be transitioning more towards what might be more legally, appropriately termed an assisted death law, because it has gone beyond assisted suicide into more what we might consider euthanasia. Honestly, Professor, I would say this. Whatever my own moral views on the issue are, and I call myself conflicted, we're at the point where the court has spoken, Parliament is acting, and I'm not fighting the battle anymore. I'm moving on from it. What I find interesting, though, is how the Church, the Catholic Church, has taken a very strong position on this. Obviously, I understood that they would be opposed to assisted suicide or euthanasia, of course. But the degree to which that they expressed their displeasure this week, to be honest, Professor, it surprised me. Can you tell me how the Church reacted?
Well, a few different things to be said. Although, of course, one has to deal with the laws of one's own country, I think it's important for people to continue to protest if they think this is a bad law. It is a massive transformation, and I think people have no idea of the actual significance of these changes will have not only on the country but on the medical profession. So I think it's continuing to worry. But specifically in terms of the way the Church thinks about it, this is most fundamentally, suicide, historically the Church called self-murder. Obviously if it's freely chosen, and we know of lots of cases in which it isn't, and that's a completely different matter. But on those cases where someone freely, intentionally chooses to kill themselves, it's, historically, before they came up with the term suicide a few centuries ago, it was known as self-murder. And, that's how, really, morally speaking, the Church thinks about it. And as obviously as we should take seriously someone killing another innocent person, it's also wrong to kill oneself. It's a very odd modern notion that somehow you own your body and you get to do with it whatever you want is a very peculiar, relatively recent in origin notion.
When we heard this week, it was the Archbishop Terence Prendergast making a statement. He had said Catholics, or even the family members of Catholics who embrace or pursue assisted suicide may face spiritual consequences here. One of the things he had mentioned was that a Catholic who pursues assisted suicide or assisted death, Professor, may not receive the last rites. I'm not myself a Catholic, but I do understand that is, I don't want to call it the nuclear option of Catholicism, but it's pretty high in the order of possible consequences from the Church.
Historically, for example, if one killed oneself and was understood to do it freely, it was seen as a kind of fundamental rejection of God, and therefore the Church kind of felt that it couldn't give one a full Catholic funeral, i.e. that one died in the good graces of one's Lord. Over the last close to a century, the Church, as kind of modern psychology developed, kind of understood more the kinds of reasons why many people committed suicide that weren't freely chosen acts. So they were tragedies through depression or a variety of other causes. And so the Church was happy to give full funerals to such people. The problem with the assisted suicide law is, of course, the government says, well, you have to be freely choosing it for it to be done, and therefore it would seem to be making this really fundamentally, morally wrong choice. And the real concern, I think, of the Church here is a classic notion that goes right back to the New Testament, of the notion of scandal, not our kind of modern notion of scandal. Scandal simply means leading another person to do something wrong. So, for example, in the Gospels, Jesus says, whoever causes the little one's sin, better for them to have a millstone tied around their neck and be thrown into the sea. Jesus took this very seriously. You need not be a bad example that might lead other people to think that something that is wrong is okay. The problem is if somebody is very freely and openly and publicly, even seeking publicity for it, seeks to say, well, I'm a Catholic and I can go ahead and kill myself, and the Church will think this is just fine by going through the regular things, that would be scandal. It might lead people to think, okay, yeah, the Church is actually okay with this, so I can go ahead and kill myself.
What do you think the reaction is? And I'm perhaps unfairly asking you to place yourself in the shoes of another here, but one of the issues that the Catholic Church obviously deals with, as does any religious faith, is the conflict between kind of the progression of societal values, I guess, and the societal view of morality, and also the idea that the edicts handed down by God or whatever your creator is in whatever religion you may be are unchanging, that they are flexible, that there are certain universal moral truths.
Right.
We know there is a natural tension here. We've already seen it in the Catholic Church on issues of birth control and divorce and homosexuality, things like that.
Yeah.
What do you think the result would be among Canadian Catholics, observant, practicing Catholics, if the Church starts to take a hard line on this? I mean, if you are an observant Catholic, and God forbid, no pun intended, but God forbid you have bone cancer and you're dying in terrible agony, I'm kind of wondering how I might feel if the Church is like, hey man, if you do this, you don't get the last rites. It would obviously be something on your mind, but I could definitely see a public backlash against that kind of a stand.
Yeah. Well, two things to say. First, on these things, people love to pull out certain issues that they may disagree with the Church on, but there are lots of others. We're probably pretty happy the Church thought the way it did. In the first part of the 20th century, for about 30, 40 years, particularly in the western provinces, we passed all these laws thinking it was a good idea to sterilize people who were considered mentally troubled or mentally defective or otherwise degenerates. The Catholic Church was pretty unusual in standing very firmly against this, as they sterilized lots of people. Alberta was doing it up until the 70s. And, of course, they've had to pay out hundreds of millions of dollars to the survivors of those sterilizations, many of whom actually weren't mentally, quote-unquote, defective at all. And so there's lots of issues in which I think people are pretty glad the Church stood against something, because I think it's not going to be long before Canadian society realizes this is kind of a disaster. The case that's brought up all the time is somebody who's got this cancer and is absolutely dying in agony. I think those cases will be or should be rare or non-existent. There's good palliative care available in this country. It should be more widely available. But there's absolutely no reason. If somebody is dying in agony, they're getting bad medical care. And they should be complaining about their physician. I think you have to understand the kind of typical cases. And I'll give you a real example. I'll change certain facts to hide anything. But there's a woman who's dying, not necessarily particularly in pain, but wants her physician to kill her. And her and her husband are really wanting a palliative care physician to do this. Finally, one day, the palliative care physician gets a call, and it's the husband of the woman saying, "Doctor, you got to keep my wife alive. You can't let her die right now, because we want to go to Switzerland next week so she can get herself killed." These are, in fact, the kind of cases you're going to get. Is people, typically the wealthier, the elite of society, who want to be able to control everything like they've done in their lives. They're going to be wanting doctors to keep them alive until they can have a kind of they're killing themselves ceremony. And I think these are, in fact, this may be another kind of extreme, but I think you can expect these kinds of cases to be as common or more common than the kinds that you're talking about. And even more troubling, I think, are the cases where you get, in a variety of jurisdictions, once you have these laws, is where lots of people start getting euthanized who have not consented, either who are able to consent or, in fact, do not want to be killed. And because once you put in physicians' minds that sometimes it's good to kill people, this whole notion of consent almost always fades away as the sole criteria for these things.
In terms of actually rolling out the new law, Professor, which we expect to see in place in a matter of months, once it is in place, what is the traditional role of the Catholic Church in matters of advocacy on these matters? For instance, we haven't had an abortion law coming up on more than 30 years now in Canada, come to think of it. And the Church obviously continues to disagree with that position. What sort of advocacy work will the Church embark on, and what kind of effect would we maybe expect to see that have?
I don't know. I don't know what specifically kind of advocacy. Like any other responsible party in Canada, they should, and I hope that they will, advocate against what they see as fundamentally unjust laws. The kinds of ways to go about doing it, I think they'll do it like you'd expect any other good citizen to seek change for the common good of society. I think that these laws are not the common good at all of Canadian society. I think they'll very soon to be shown to be contrary to that. So, what kind of specific policy? It's not really for me to say. I'm not a bishop. I'm not a, per se, leader in the Church, but I certainly hope that they will continue to speak out against it and hopefully be able to articulate better exactly why this is such a bad decision for Canadian society. We have to understand that laws in society always, in some sense, reflect the moral view of that society. Or kind of policies, even from the trivial. I mean, even, when you think about it, when they started charging a nickel for plastic bags, I mean, people started using a lot less of them, even though probably the amount of effort they took to avoid using plastic bags was much more than a nickel's worth of effort. So this is a bad thing. Try to do something else. And laws or policies always, in some sense, reflect some kind of view about morality, about the common good. So the church ought to, I hope it will, continue to strongly voice its opposition to basically killing of innocent people. I mean, the worst part of this, I think, not the worst part. The worst part is what's going to happen to some of the victims of this. But the other really bad part that nobody questions is why do they want doctors to be doing this? Killing is not complicated. Lots of people do it all the time. And this is going to corrupt the profession. Deeply corrupt the profession, which we depend upon greatly.
Professor, for what it's worth.
Physicians to think, when it gets really hard to treat a patient, I can just kill them.
Professor, for what it's worth on this one, I suspect you and I are on opposite sides of the assisted suicide debate, but I actually completely agree with you on that point. And I've written before, both as a pragmatic matter and also as a way of sidestepping some of the moral issues that this would raise, that the actual administration of either euthanasia or assisted suicide can just as easily be put into, I called them basically, it was a somewhat uncharitable term, I concede, but basically death technicians. I mean, you could easily separate that, and I know that wouldn't address all the moral issues that go along with assisted suicide or something, but I think at the very least it may have streamlined some of the debate around the medical ethics side of this, where you could have someone who specialized in administering the procedure, and I think that would be kind of a weird job to put on your LinkedIn profile, but it would be a way of sidestepping some of the medical debates. Professor, we've run out the clock here. I've got to let you go. It's been a fascinating discussion. We really appreciate your time this morning. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome, Matt. Pleasure to be with you.
And the pleasure was mine. John Berkman, Professor of Moral Theology at the University of Toronto, joining me here on National Post Radio this morning. We are going to be back in a couple of minutes.